When the American pilots first stepped onto the tarmac in the Pacific Sun and saw the strange green shapes sitting before them, they didn't realize they were looking at one of Japan's most iconic aircraft of World War II, the Mitsubishi G4M, codenamed Betty. Its elegant, almost fragile design gleamed under the light, its long, slender wings stretching like those of a bird built for grace, not war. Yet this bomber had carried destruction across the Pacific, striking at Allied bases from the Philippines to Guadalcanal. Now, a captured Betty stood silent, stripped of its rising sun markings, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. The U.S. pilots circled it cautiously, half in awe, half in disbelief. They had heard stories from Navy pilots who fought them in dogfights, how the Betty could outpace American bombers, how it could fly incredible distances. But they had also heard of its terrifying vulnerability, how even a few bullets could set it ablaze, how Japanese crews often went down in flaming wreckage. And as the Americans examined the aircraft up close, they began to understand why. The fuselage looked impossibly thin. The skin of the bomber, made of lightweight aluminum, seemed almost delicate to the touch. There were no armored plates around the cockpit, no bulletproof glass. And then came the most shocking discovery. The massive fuel tanks inside the wings were completely unprotected. No self-sealing, no armor, nothing. Just raw tanks filled with highly flammable fuel, flying firebombs waiting to ignite at the first hit point, one of the American engineers muttered. No wonder these things burn so fast. But that realization raised another question. Why would Japan design such an advanced long-range bomber, only to leave it so defenseless? The Americans were used to aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress, which carried heavy armor, self-sealing tanks, and defensive guns bristling from every angle. The Betty, in contrast, seemed almost suicidal. As the test pilots prepared to fly the captured aircraft, they reviewed its blueprints and performance notes. The G4M had impressive specifications for its time: twin Mitsubishi Kase engines, a range of nearly 3,000 miles, and the ability to carry torpedoes for anti-ship missions. It was designed for speed and distance, not survival. Every ounce of weight mattered to the Japanese engineers, and anything that could slow the bomber down or shorten its range was sacrificed. So, they eliminated the self-sealing tanks. They removed armor. They even kept the fuselage thin to reduce drag. The result was a bomber that could strike deep into enemy territory, far beyond what the Americans thought possible, but at an unimaginable cost. As the American pilots climbed into the cockpit, they noticed how cramped and exposed everything felt. The pilot's seat offered almost no protection, the glass canopy thin and vulnerable. The instrument panel was simple, efficient, but lacked the rugged robustness of American designs. Every control seemed built for function, not comfort. The co-pilot's station was tight, and the gunner positions even worse, cramped, cold, and terrifyingly open to enemy fire. During the test flight, the Betty surprised everyone. The engines roared to life smoothly, the aircraft lifting off with a grace that belied its size. It climbed fast, responded quickly, and cruised with ease. The American test pilot later said it felt alive, like a creature built for motion, not battle. At full throttle, the Betty could outrun many Allied fighters of the early war years. Its range was stunning. It could fly missions that were beyond the reach of almost any other bomber in the Pacific, and suddenly, the Americans understood why Japan had built it this way. The Betty wasn't meant to survive dogfights. It was meant to reach targets so far away that no enemy fighters could touch it. It was a bomber for an empire spread across the Pacific, a weapon of reach rather than endurance. But the war had changed. By 1943, American air power had expanded. Long-range fighters like the P-38 Lightning began to appear, and carrier groups were pushing deeper into Japanese territory. The skies were no longer Japan's alone. The Betty's long legs couldn't save it anymore. When intercepted, its lack of protection made it easy prey. A few bursts from a .50 caliber gun could turn it into a blazing comet, spiraling into the ocean below. Still, the Betty played a role in some of the most daring missions of the war. It carried Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, on his final flight in 1943, when American cryptographers intercepted his plans and P-38s ambushed his formation. Yamamoto's Betty went down in flames, a tragic symbol of the bomber's brilliance and fatal flaw. The American engineers, after weeks of study, sent detailed reports back to Washington. They marveled at the Japanese design philosophy, extreme efficiency, range at all costs, and a willingness to accept death as part of the mission. The lack of self-sealing tanks wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated choice, reflecting a mindset where completing the mission mattered more than coming home. In that realization, the Americans glimpsed something profound about their enemy. This wasn't just about engineering, it was about ideology. Where American designers built to protect their crews, the Japanese built to achieve the objective, no matter the sacrifice. The Betty's design reflected the spirit of the time: fast, daring, and doomed. As the captured bomber rolled to a stop after its test flight, one pilot looked back at the sleek machine and shook his head. "Beautiful," he said softly, "but deadly to its own men." And somewhere deep down, they couldn't help but respect it. A machine born of desperation and brilliance, a ghost from a nation that had dared to dream of empire across the seas. In the days that followed, the American test crew grew more familiar with the captured Betty. They began flying it more boldly, pushing it to its limits, testing climb rates, fuel consumption, and handling under different conditions. What fascinated them most wasn't just the aircraft's speed, it was the sense that every inch of it had been designed with ruthless purpose. The Japanese engineers had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what was needed to fly far and fast. It was minimalism taken to an extreme point. One U.S. Navy pilot, Lieutenant Harold Green, recorded in his notes that flying the Betty felt like running barefoot across glass. You could go fast, but you never forgot how fragile you were. The wings flexed alarmingly during dives, and the sound of the engines at full throttle filled the cockpit like a living heartbeat. The airplane responded instantly, almost too eagerly, as if it wanted to go faster than the pilot dared. But beneath that elegance was danger. On one test flight, the right engine developed a small oil leak. The crew aborted the mission immediately, afraid that even the smallest malfunction could spell disaster. They had read the reports. Bettys caught fire easily, sometimes exploding midair without warning. The thought of sitting between unprotected fuel tanks filled with volatile aviation gasoline made every minute in the air feel like borrowed time. When they opened up the wing panels back on the ground, the Americans were stunned again. The tanks weren't just unarmored, they were practically integrated into the wings themselves, as though the entire structure had been designed to carry fuel. A single tracer round could have turned the entire wing into an inferno. The U.S. engineers shook their heads. "They built a masterpiece of range," one said, "and a nightmare for the men who flew it." They began comparing notes with intelligence officers and pilots returning from the Pacific. Stories came in from fighter squadrons that had fought against the Betty. Pilots described shooting at them and watching them burst into flames almost instantly. Sometimes the aircraft would continue flying for a few seconds, fully engulfed, before disintegrating. Yet those same pilots also respected the Betty's speed and agility. Many remembered how difficult it was to catch in the early years of the war, before newer fighters arrived. The Americans studying the captured plane, the contradiction was fascinating. How could something so fragile be so formidable? The answer lay in strategy. Japan's war plan in the early 1940s depended on distance. Its empire stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific, from the home islands to the Dutch East Indies. To control that vast ocean, the Imperial Navy needed bombers that could reach remote targets and return without refueling. The G4M was built to make that possible. It could take off from island bases like Rabaul or Saipan and strike ships hundreds of miles away. No American bomber of comparable size could match its range at the time, but to achieve that, the designers at Mitsubishi had to sacrifice everything else. Weight was the enemy. Armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy gun mounts, all of it added pounds that would shorten the aircraft's legs. So they stripped it bare. The Betty became a weapon of reach and speed, not survival. The U.S. pilots couldn't help but admire the brutal logic of it. They understood that Japan had built a machine perfectly suited to its early war ambitions: light, fast, and deadly in the hands of skilled crews. Yet, they also saw how that same design philosophy doomed it once the tide of war turned. As the Americans gained air superiority, the Pacific sky grew increasingly dangerous for unprotected bombers. Newer Allied aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, the P-38 Lightning, and later the P-51 Mustang could catch and destroy Bettys long before they reached their targets. Even anti-aircraft fire from ships became more accurate and deadly. The Betty's thin skin offered no protection. Still, the Japanese crews kept flying. Accounts from captured pilots revealed an astonishing sense of duty. Many Betty pilots knew that their aircraft were death traps, yet they volunteered for missions anyway. For them, survival was secondary to service. Some even saw the vulnerability of their aircraft as a test of courage. By 1944, the Betty had become a symbol of both bravery and futility. It was pressed into desperate roles, nighttime torpedo runs, suicide missions, and finally, as transports for high-ranking officers. The Americans studying the captured aircraft could hardly imagine the mental strength it took to board one of these planes, knowing how fragile it was. Lieutenant Green noted in his report, "This bomber isn't built for men who expect to live. It's built for men who expect to succeed or die trying." That line spread quietly through the intelligence offices. It captured something essential about the war's psychology. The Betty was more than an airplane. It was a mirror of Japan's wartime mindset. In their own factories, American engineers continued building aircraft with the opposite philosophy: protect the crew, maximize survival chances, and rely on numbers and logistics to win. But the Betty showed them how different cultures could reach entirely different conclusions about what mattered most. During one demonstration flight at a U.S. base, visiting generals watched the captured Betty take off and circle overhead. The pilot flew low, showing off its graceful wings and smooth handling. One general leaned over to another and whispered, "If that thing ever had armor, we'd have been in real trouble early on." It was true. The Betty's aerodynamic design was ahead of its time. Even stripped bare, it could carry heavy loads over immense distances. But its fatal flaw, the unprotected fuel system, remained impossible to ignore. After every flight, the crew returned with a mix of admiration and dread. They knew they were flying a masterpiece of efficiency, and a coffin with wings. Some joked about it darkly. Others grew silent whenever they had to refuel it. The smell of gasoline lingered, sharp and dangerous, reminding everyone how thin the line was between control and catastrophe. By late 1943, American intelligence had fully documented the Betty's construction, performance, and weaknesses. The information proved invaluable to Allied strategists. It confirmed that Japan's long-range bombing capability came at a terrible cost, and it explained why so many Bettys went down in flames. Yet, in studying the aircraft so closely, the Americans gained a strange kind of respect for it. The Betty wasn't poorly designed, it was designed for a different kind of war, one Japan believed it could win before the enemy adapted. It was a weapon born of ambition, fueled by desperation, and doomed by its own brilliance. As the last light of day faded over the runway, the captured bomber stood in silence once more. Its engines had cooled, its fuel drained for safety. The test crew walked away, some glancing back at its sleek outline against the darkening sky. In its stillness, they saw a ghost of another world, a reminder that even the most beautiful machines can carry the weight of tragedy. As time passed, the captured Betty bomber became more than just a curiosity, it became a lesson. American engineers, pilots, and strategists dissected every detail of its design, hoping to uncover what made the Japanese think this fragile bomber could dominate the skies. What they discovered changed their understanding of the enemy's mindset forever. Inside the Betty's stripped-down fuselage, everything told a story of sacrifice. The seats were thin and uncomfortable. The gun mounts were light and exposed. Even the wiring was routed in the most direct way possible, with no effort to shield or reinforce it. This was an aircraft built not for the comfort or safety of its crew, but for range, speed, and efficiency. Every ounce saved men more miles of flight, more reach across the endless Pacific. The Americans knew that in war, design reflected doctrine. And this doctrine was clear: Mission above MEN.IN post-war interviews. Japanese engineers admitted they knew the risks of building bombers without self-sealing tanks. They understood that a single tracer could ignite the aircraft. But in 1939 and 1940, when Japan was planning for rapid conquest, speed was life. The Imperial Navy believed the war would be short, fought quickly before the industrial might of the United States could fully awaken. They gambled everything on striking first, striking deep, and striking fast. The Betty was the perfect weapon for that vision, until the world changed around it.by 1943. Japan was fighting a different war. The Betty's long range no longer mattered as much as survival. The Allies were advancing island by island, bringing airfields and carriers ever closer to Japan's home front. The skies were no longer open, they were filled with American fighters. The Betty, once untouchable, became easy prey. Still, the aircraft kept flying. The Imperial Japanese Navy had no replacement ready, so they pushed their Betty crews to continue missions even as losses mounted. For the men who flew them, each takeoff was an act of faith. They knew the odds were against them. Many pilots carried small personal charms, prayers, or family letters in their flight suits, reminders of what they were risking everything for. When American intelligence units analyzed captured Japanese diaries after the war, they found haunting words from Betty crewmen. One wrote, "We are told to fly as if already dead. Then fear cannot reach us." Another simply said, "Our plane is fast enough to reach any target, but too weak to return." The Americans who read those lines couldn't help but feel a deep, uneasy respect. The Betty wasn't just a bomber. It was a symbol of Japan's belief that duty and honor outweighed survival. Back at the test base, U.S. pilots continued experimenting with the captured aircraft, this time comparing it directly against American designs. Side by side, the differences were staggering. The B-25 Mitchell, for example, looked bulky but safe, its thick armor plating and self-sealing tanks giving its crew a fighting chance. The Betty, in contrast, was slim, sleek, and vulnerable, almost alien by comparison. When the Betty's engines roared to life beside the Mitchell, it seemed to whisper a different philosophy entirely. Test pilot Harold Green wrote in his final report, "The Betty flies like a dream, but she dies like a candle in the wind." That line became famous among those who read it. It summed up the entire paradox of the captured bomber, a machine of extraordinary grace and fatal fragility. In one demonstration for high-ranking officers, the Betty was flown at low altitude to show its agility. As it banked and turned, the generals watched silently. The aircraft looked like it was dancing, its wings slicing cleanly through the air. When it landed, a general walked up to the crew and asked what they thought of it. One of the engineers replied, "Sir, it's what happens when you design beauty without mercy." The comment struck everyone. Because that was exactly what the Betty represented. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful for war. But beauty had no armor, and mercy had no place in the skies of the Pacific. As the war neared its end, the Betty's role shifted once more. No longer capable of surviving standard bombing runs, it was used for transport and later for kamikaze missions. The same unprotected fuel tanks that once doomed so many crews now made it perfect for suicide attacks. The fuel would ignite on impact, turning the aircraft into an instant fireball. The Betty had come full circle, from a weapon of reach to a weapon of desperation. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, many surviving Bettys were grounded across airfields throughout the Pacific. Their paint was faded, their fuselages riddled with bullet holes. Some were abandoned, others captured intact. American forces studied several of them closely, and one of those was likely the same type examined years earlier by the test team who couldn't understand why it lacked protection. For those pilots, the answer had come not just from engineering, but from understanding the enemy's spirit. Japan's war machine wasn't built on the same principles as America's. It was built on belief. Belief in the mission, in sacrifice, and in a vision of empire that valued duty over life. In the months after the war, reports from the Betty tests circulated among aircraft designers. Some saw it as a cautionary tale. Others saw innovation. The idea of long-range, lightweight bombers would resurface in future jet designs, but with one crucial difference: protection would never again be sacrificed so completely for performance. By the late 1940s, most of the captured Betty bombers were scrapped or left to rot in hangars. A few were displayed briefly in war museums, then forgotten. Today, only fragments remain, pieces of metal, faded photographs, and the stories of the men who flew and studied them. But in those remains lies a deeper truth. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks weren't just a design flaw, they were the physical embodiment of a wartime philosophy. They represented the idea that courage could substitute for armor, that willpower could replace technology. And while that belief inspired incredible bravery, it also led to devastating losses. Years later, when veterans from both sides met in reconciliation ceremonies, some American pilots recalled the Betty with a mix of awe and sadness. One said, "They flew those things knowing what would happen if they were hit. You can't not respect that." The Betty, in all its contradictions, became a legend. To historians, it was a technical marvel undone by its own ambition. To the men who fought against it, it was a ghost that burned too brightly to last. And to the American pilots who once examined it under the hot Pacific sun, wondering why anyone would build a bomber without protected fuel tanks, it was the moment they realized that war isn't always about who builds the strongest machine. Sometimes, it's about who believes the most in what they're fighting for. As one final test pilot wrote in his personal diary before the Betty was retired for good. "She's light, fragile, and hopelessly doomed. But when she flies, you forget all that. You only see her beauty cutting through the air, and for a second, you understand why they built her this way." In the end, the story of the captured Betty wasn't just about design or strategy. It was about humanity. It was about how two nations looked at the same sky and saw two different paths to victory. The Americans built fortresses. The Japanese built arrows. And in that difference, history was written in fire and smoke across the Pacific. When the last surviving Betty was dismantled, a few of its parts were preserved in storage. Among them was a fuel tank, thin, unarmored, fragile. It sits now in a museum archive, silent testimony to a question that once baffled the world's greatest pilots. Why would anyone build a bomber without protecting its heart? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the metal, but in the men who flew it.